Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Megan Maldonado, and I want to start a new series on medieval romance. So before we get into actual medieval romance, especially medieval English romance, I think it's important that we understand some different bits of literature, scripture, not scripture, poems, prose, that is important to get a grip on medieval romance. So before we get into the whole world of King Arthur and different knights and quests and giants and maybe even some dragons along the way, let's talk about some of the other important works that really come to bear on our readings of these really fascinating stories. Okay, first up is the Bible. Probably not a surprise, this is the most important text you can read to understand medieval anything, irrespective of geography, time, century, language, what have you. It's going to be important to understanding not just medieval romance specifically, but medieval literature, medieval culture, medieval philosophy and beliefs. So pretty much the whole Bible is going to be essential. I would say it's worthwhile, if you're not familiar with the text, to focus on the Gospels and the Psalms. The Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Psalms are 150 poems. They were believed to have, I believe, in the Middle Ages, they would have thought that David had written all of them. But suffice it to say, the entirety of the Bible is important to know, even just to read medieval literature of any kind. Okay, now we have the Aeneid. So this is a Roman poem by Virgil. Dante has a lot to say about and through Virgil, but setting him aside for now, the Aeneid is an epic about Aeneas, and this involves the Trojan War and the founding of Rome. Why is this important for understanding romance and medieval English romance? Well, I would say a couple of reasons. One, this is the seminal epic hero quest, at least for lots of medieval romances. It's not the only epic poem from antiquity, certainly, but this is important because it helps us see the precursor to a hero going on a quest and having all these different tangents that he gets on, these side stories and the kind of winding tale that he might go on. There's that element to it where we see, okay, yes, I understand that this kind of thing gets reflected in the Middle Ages. Another thing, though, is that this text helps us see this the founding of Britain that is a little bit of wishful thinking that Geoffrey of Monmouth picks up on. We'll get to him in a second. But we have Brutus going in, becoming, he's a descendant of Aeneas, by the way, coming in and founding Britain. And so this isn't just an important text for seeing the genre lineage, that is to say, how romance got its start and why it's told in a specific kind of way. But we also have this be useful for our readings because it helps us see that Britain wants to participate in this long line of epic poetry, epic history, and empire. Next up, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, the Metamorphoses are not one set narrative, but a collection of narratives. They're written in Latin, and you can find translations easily. They feature lots of stories about transformations, hence metamorphoses, but different kinds. Think of, if you happen to know the Greek myth of Apollo and Daphne, Daphne turning into a tree. After running away from Apollo, you have people turning into different animals. So there's not one particular bit of the Metamorphoses I would recommend so much as understanding that sudden transformations, whether you would call it magical or pagan or even divine, these are important motifs that do become reflected in medieval romance. Okay, now on to Augustine. You can't talk about anything medieval without talking about St. Augustine. Augustine of Hippo was a late antiquity, that is kind of late stage Roman Empire saint, and he has lots to write about and lots of it is worth reading. I would say the most important texts, I would start with Confessions. Confessions is going to be pretty vital. It's an important articulation of medieval theology, or what will come to be integral to medieval theology, that many writers will pick up on, whether they're actual theologians or romance poets. And City of God is likewise pretty significant, especially as a kind of organizing political philosophy. It's not just relevant in political works. Something like the Pearl poem, which isn't a romance, Gown and the Green Knight is, same manuscript, but the Pearl poem picks up a lot of City of God. So what Augustine you need is gonna be dependent on the text, but Confessions certainly, I think, is a great place to start. Okay, now I really should have a copy of this one handy, but I don't. This is why I should get my channel monetized. Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. This is huge in the Middle Ages. Chaucer does his own translation into Middle English. You don't have to read it in Middle English necessarily. There are modern English translations. You don't have to read it in Latin either. But the Consolation of Philosophy is written from the perspective of a man in prison, because Boethius was in fact in prison when he wrote it. And it's a complicated and beautiful reflection on the nature of life, its difficulties, fate, why good things happen and bad things happen when you maybe want them to happen to you and they're happening to bad people, or you're suffering and you don't really understand why. There's much more to it, but suffice it to say that this text is not just cited and alluded to in certain poems, romances, etc., but this text, Consolation of Philosophy, is also reflective of a larger philosophical schema of medieval writers wanting to wrestle with the difficulties of living, and how do you contain your existential struggle in a poetic form, and how do you work through it and continue to live with these difficulties. It's a beautiful text, highly recommend just for reading, but also pretty important for understanding medieval literature. Okay, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, or Historia Regum Britanniae, I think it is. This is where we start to get Arthur. So you've heard of King Arthur, Camelot, all that. This is where we start to get a more concretized understanding of who Arthur is supposed to be in the medieval imagination. Now, he is not a real king, King Arthur. Much of the history of the kings of Britain is creative history, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. It's relevant to the literature, it's cited as a text of significance. I believe that it's cited in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight even as a historical book. Somebody fact check me on that. All right, now this one is technically a series of romances, so we are kind of getting into actual romances here, but this is Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian Romances. This is a collection that admittedly is in English, so you don't have to read the original language, the original French if you can't, but what is vital about these is that you have Arthur, you have Lancelot, you have other heroes, by the way, coming in to the fore that will get picked up in Middle English. Now, again, do you have to read these in order to understand the Middle English romances? Not necessarily, but to get set up and to read the OG text, so to speak, Chrétien de Troyes, this is going to be really helpful and really enriching, I think, for your reading of the English versions of some of these stories, because there are pretty critical differences. Now, this is just my little list here of some pretty important texts that are helpful for understanding medieval literature and medieval romance in particular. But depending on the romance, you might have other texts that will be important to read. I mentioned that Pearl, which again is not a romance, but Pearl evokes lots of City of God, whereas you might encounter another text that really recalls, I don't know, something historical in the period, and reading some historical documents would enrich your reading of that particular text. So it really depends on what you're doing. Some anthologies like this guy here, this is by Broadview. This is a Broadview anthology of medieval literature, or the famously assigned, I have an old version, Norton Anthology of English Literature. This is the first volume, so it has some of the medieval text. They will give you some contextual information. These are student-friendly, beginner-friendly to the periods, of what you need to know, what texts are helpful to know. Usually if you have some edited edition, there will be notes from the scholar who edited it saying, okay, this is a reference to X text, but going into your own readings, it's going to be useful. And I think the texts I named are going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of getting a better grasp on the culture, history, philosophy, theology of the period. And that's all I got to say about that. So if you like what I do, you can like, share, and subscribe. And we're going to talk more about medieval romances, getting into especially Middle English romances, not just how to read them, but what's so fun and interesting and thought-provoking about them. So stay tuned for those, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.